I'm Julia White. I sit in our industry and commerce team here at IAC. So I will recruit anything that's in-house. Looking at internal audit, risk management, internal controls, compliance. We've also got an IT audit consultant, just so that you're aware, that's quite a hot spot at the moment. And we cover a global remit. So UK is our biggest presence, but we also recruit over in the US, rest of Europe, East Asia, etc. as well. So I've been at IAC now for 4 years. I was at Michael Page for 2 years prior to that, coming out of uni. I essentially, I guess, set up a Women in Audit webinar or network forum group a couple of years ago now. It started off quite small. It's quite overwhelming, actually, the amount of female heads of audit. So it did start off quite small to sort of get used to doing them. But this is our kind of first large event. So it's a shame we can't do them face to face, but hopefully this will be just as rewarding and just as fun. So set that up 2 years ago. And actually, that's kind of how I lead Zoe in here. Zoe was in the head of audit forum network because at that time she was a head of internal audit. We met, well, I was recruiting for her. I did manage to recruit that person for her, so it's successful. But I went down to meet her in Mayfair. We sat and chatted about recruitment. And then Zoe shared with me that she has a real passion for coaching and leadership coaching. And she was like, I really want to go into that. I want to develop my career. And I thought that was phenomenal. And I've seen her do that. So I've witnessed her make that move from being a head of internal audit to where she is now. So it was a bit of a no-brainer to get her to be involved with this webinar. She was the only person that I wanted to do it. So thank goodness she said yes. And then she, of course, got her fantastic colleague, Glin, to get involved as well. So at that point, I'm going to now lead over to Zoe and Glin to introduce themselves.
Jules, hi everybody. Right, I'm just going to start sharing my screen. So hopefully you can see Luminary Mindset. So as Jules introduced me, I was a very willing head of internal audit and risk for a number of years. I was head of audit at Mighty and at Howden as well for a number of years in the UK. We're now actually in Sydney. Now I need to remember to say this when I do these webinars, because I actually spoke to somebody one-on-one last week and he didn't realise that I was in Sydney. He'd come to a webinar and he wanted to catch up and he thought I was in London. So we're in Sydney. I relocated out here last year with my coaching consultancy, and Glin, you've been here 4 years?
5 years now. 5
years now, right? So we are absolutely loving being in Sydney, and obviously it's a different environment right now for us than it is for you in England, but we are still very well connected with England and have a number of clients over there still. So we are thrilled to have been invited to do this. I'm going to cover off the first half of this session where I'm going to talk to you about emotional intelligence and leadership. Now, the thing that I noticed when I was head of audit and risk was I was getting to access and witness and watch a lot of very interesting conversations. When you're sat in the boardroom, when you're sat in the executive meetings, when you're getting that helicopter view of an organisation nobody else in the organisation has access to, you become very privileged and you become you gain an insight that not many other people have. And because I spent a lot of my time in that role listening, because that part of the role is to listen for and understand the different risk and control environment, I was starting to see patterns of behaviour and patterns of leadership style that were either more successful or less successful than others. Please put themselves on. Thank you. What I then did with that insight was I transferred it into the conversations that I was having with the leadership teams in the organisations that I was working with. And then I retrained to be a coach. And then I started doing tandem. And what coaching is all about is it's about asking questions, it's about inquiring, it's about believing that the person that you're talking to has already. So it's about being an element of unknowing in what you're sharing and what you're saying. Thank you. Mute would be great from everybody. Thank you very much. So what we're going to cover off today is emotional intelligence and leadership. And emotional intelligence is becoming more and more important now than ever before. And what emotional intelligence is it's the ability for us to manage our own and other people's emotions. And what we tend to do in the corporate world is we tend to focus a lot on IQ, we tend to focus on technical skill set, we tend to focus on what we know, and we don't tend to focus in as much on what people's emotional state is, because it's the emotions that we have that drive our decision making, and it's the emotions that we have that result in us being who we are as a leader, and that then translates into tangible outcomes. So we're going to focus very much on the intangible, and it's the emotional side of things, and it's the way that you're being and showing up as a leader. So the first thing that I'd like to share with you is the change curve. Now, a lot of people, we sent an email out to everybody to say, why are you showing up to this webinar, and what is it that you're interested in? And a lot of us are having to deal with change, and we're either going through change internally because we're choosing to, so we're choosing to pivot and diversify or change our strategy, and therefore we need people to change internally, or we're being exposed to this external environment that's changing around us. And so we're all having to deal with change. This change curve I absolutely love, because it effectively describes the emotional journey that people go on when going through change. And I don't know, I'm going to ask you to use the chat box actually, because as I talk about this, it'd be great for you to share with me or with us where you're actually at on this change curve, where you are personally or where your teams are. I believe that maybe in England, people have hit the bottom of the dip, so they've hit the anger or the despair, and we're now trying to figure out how we're going to come out the other side of this change curve. All of the developed economies have declared that we're in the biggest recession that we've been in since the 80s. So governments and businesses are trying to figure out how we're going to get ourselves out of that situation. So we need to start pulling or pushing our teams up the other side of the change curve. And that's going to require emotional resilience, and it's going to require us to be able to help them emotionally and deal with that. There's been a lot of emotional trauma over the last 6 months. People have had to deal with isolation. A lot of us have had to deal with working from home. Some of us have had to do that while looking after several children, and we've also had to be in close proximity with our partners if we've got one, in a way that we've never had to deal with before. So there's a huge amount of emotional processing that needs to go on. What we don't want to have happen, and this is a watch out for you as leaders, is we don't want people to get stuck. So people can get stuck at the bottom of this change curve if they're not given the time or opportunity to process the emotions that they've been feeling. And I'll talk about that on the next 2 slides when I talk about your communication style as a leader and also your decision making. But it'd be great if anybody can recognize themselves on this change curve. If you could pop it in the chat box just to let us know, where are you and where are your teams, and are people coming out of it? I'd love to hear from anybody if you're actually coming out of it. Oh, thanks Tessa, exploring. So you're starting to come out of the change curve. Brilliant, exploring. I thought as much. That's great. It's, yeah, brilliant. You can see that everybody's brilliant, perfect. So that means that you're actually starting to come out of it. And oh no, we've got someone there that's in a different place. Anger, unlikely to change. Yeah, okay, so you've got a merger going on, coming out of exploring and figuring out the next steps. And what kind of things are you noticing with your teams? Are your teams moving into exploring willingly, or are there any people that you can recognize as being stuck? Are you finding it easy? Are you finding it hard? Because the exploring phase is really the most critical. It's the really critical point where you need to be really supporting people so that they can keep going, because this isn't a one-way street. People don't move along the change curve in one direction. They can fall back and then they can move forward. And the dip isn't the same for everyone either. The dip can be a bit more flat for some rather than others. Yeah, so hard, yeah. Yeah, people, yeah, they're looking for leadership to move them from the bottom of the curve. Absolutely. Okay, perfect. Well, let's get you to some of those answers, because people are looking to leadership for ways out of the curve. And as I said at the bottom of this slide, we need to know how to move organisations through this curve, upwards and downwards. Yeah, movements can also, yeah, absolutely brilliant. Thank you for your contribution. That's wonderful. So communication. So your teams at the moment will be listening through a filter. So when we have experiences and when we feel emotions, we create memories, and those memories are created in our bodies. Actually, we feel the emotions, and then it creates a visual or a thought, a memory that occurs as a thought. But what that means is when you're talking to people, they're listening through a filter that is determined by the experience that they've had. So if someone's had a good experience in the last 6 months, or an average experience, they'll be listening through a different filter to someone who's had a huge amount of trauma. Maybe they've been furloughed, maybe they've had to take on more work, maybe they've had a hugely stressful situation at home. So it's really important just to frame this slide that we understand that when I'm talking about communication, it's not necessarily what you say, it's what people are hearing that is the communication that's most important at the moment. So you are what you say. Integrity and vision is vital. So please be mindful of the fact that everything you say is being recorded. People are taking it in much more than they ever have before. When we go down to the dip in this change curve, we have a heightened sense of danger, in inverted commas, because our neuroscience, our brain and our body are in fight or flight mode. People are coming out of a state of survival and crisis management. So their bodies and their brains are going to be looking for signals of threat. They're going to be looking for signs that things aren't right, or that they need to worry or have anxiety. So what you say and how you say it is really important. If you can have integrity in your communication and make sure that you're consistent and you're aligning yourself with the vision that you set out for the team, that's going to give them the sense of security and safety emotionally that they'll need to then build trust to move forward. They're looking for that consistency. So it's not just consistency in what you're saying, but it's also consistency in the messaging from the leadership team. So ensuring as a leadership team that there's a commitment, even if there's disagreement, there's a commitment that externally that communication is consistent, just to kind of reduce the levels of anxiety and uncertainty across the organisation. How are your teams listening? Now, it's really important that we inquire into how your teams are listening. You can't tell that from just looking at them or even just listening to what they're saying. You must ask the question. So the question that I just asked you about where are you on the change curve, ask people that. Ask them about the experience that they've had, ask them about where they're struggling, and you don't need to do anything with the information that they give to you necessarily. It's the case of just allowing the experience to be acknowledged and shared, which we'll come on to later. It's about allowing people to talk about what's happened to them so that they can move on from it. It's all part of what we're calling the grief process, which is what this is, to then have people process what's happened to them and feel supported and heard. That will give you a real indication of what filters you've got going on around you, and then that means you can adapt your communication style accordingly. So adapting your communication style, and for example, fear needs to feel reassurance. So if you know you've got people stuck in fear, then the reassuring communication or the reassuring listening ear is what they need. Anger just needs to feel heard. So actually it's not about you saying anything, it's about you just being a clearing for that anger to be expressed, and being a clearing for that anger to be acknowledged. And anxiety, especially, we have got a lot of people who are in anxiety, and anxiety needs a plan. So if we haven't got a plan in place, we're going to feel very anxious and we're going to feel very unhinged. So, and a lot of my clients are currently saying to me, look, we can't plan, we can't reassure our teams. There are certain things that you can reassure them about. You can absolutely reassure them that you're going to stick to your company values and you're going to do the right thing by them, even if it's not a tangible plan, even if it doesn't mean that your strategy or your future outlook or their job security is confirmed. But you can commit to being a certain way, you can commit to leading in a certain way. That means that it gives them some reassurance about what's going to happen to them. The final point is highlighted because in doing all of this, you're going to start getting feedback from your teams and from the organisation. Because if you do this with your stakeholders as well, you might find yourself being overwhelmed with feedback. The key to this is not over-personalising it. So try not to identify with it. Try not to take it on board as personal. Just take it on board as this is where people are at on the change curve. It is what it is right now. And I'm just creating I'm just enabling the process of change and movement through the change curve. It doesn't mean anything about me and my leadership. If you can stand in that space, you're going to be much more useful to your team and to the people around you. When we personalize things, we go into the I, we go into the ego, and then we make it about us. And then our internal dialogue gets all messed up in our communication. And that's when things start to break down. So if you can really just receive it as a kind of a blank slate, that would be very useful to your teams and the broader audience. Decision making. And please, if you do have questions, do put them in the group chat, because Julia is monitoring I know I've just done sorry Julia, I've just done a deluge of comments to the chat box, which if you can sift through them and find the questions, that would be great. Sorry, I just realised you'll be like, oh my goodness, where are the questions? So that's communication, and that's about the listening that you've got around you and how to access, you know, where people are at and how to really understand what they need. Decision making has been a huge, obviously decision making now is not like it was before. So what we're used to being able to plan out into the future. We're used to being able to use past data and past experiences to plan for the future. We haven't got any of that stability or certainty anymore. So we can't use past experience now because we're in a completely unknown environment, and we can't rely on any data that's trying to extrapolate into the future because, again, it's unknown. So that brings up a lot of fear and anxiety in people, and that brings up a lot of chaos and confusion at times. But really, decision making from fear is natural, but it often results in us trying to not get things wrong, and it can influence our decision making in a not so positive way. We need to start encouraging a culture of things not working out the way we expect them to being accepted to a degree. So this is about risk appetite and risk tolerance. Yeah. So the risk appetite and risk tolerance framework in all of our organizations must have shifted and has to have shifted, but there needs to be more of an open dialogue about what that means for our decision making. If you have existed in an organization where there was a culture of blame, or there was a culture of holding others to account and making them wrong for not delivering on their objectives, if that culture has been in place in the past, that's not going to work now from an emotional intelligence perspective, because that's not a safe environment for people to call out when things aren't going the way they expected. So people need to feel safe in their decision making, and they need to feel emotionally safe that if something's not going to plan, they can put their hand up and say, actually, due to the ever-changing landscape that we're now operating in, this is what's happening and this is what I need to share with you. We're going to naturally keep trying to predict the future so that we can make the right decision today, and that's not something that you can stop. That's a natural part of the sort of the human condition, if you like. But what you can do is, when you find your mind going to the future and trying to predict the future, there's a part of emotional intelligence that's called reality testing. If you just bring yourself back into the present moment, bring yourself back to the facts that you have in front of you today, and notice what decision you can make based on the facts today, and be in communication around that. So be really clear in your communication. Actually, I'm making this decision based on the best facts that I have today, and that might change. And when it does, and if it does change, I'll be in communication again. So this again is part of emotional intelligence. It's having that ability to assert yourself and express yourself in a really clear way without shirking any of your responsibilities or accountabilities, but just being really confident and clear that actually these are the assumptions that I've made based on the information that I have today, and feel free to allow me to update that. I've just got a comment through saying, yeah, that's brilliant, thank you Niam. Yeah. We'll come to that afterwards. So yeah, so decision making is, so we're finding ourselves in the position where we're having to be more agile in our decision making, and we're having to give each other more room and space to flex in our decision making. So again, that's going to be a cultural shift for some of your organizations, because previously, if you've worked in a very predictable industry, that's the decision making would have been much less of a sort of a cause for concern or anxiety, which is what's coming up now. And again, that goes back to the change curve. Linking this back to that dip that people have just experienced in the change curve, when we're in that dip, we're in survival mode. So survival mode leadership, you will have all seen this play out, and please raise your hand or put a comment if you have. But when leaders, especially CEOs who are very much on their own, they don't have that support structure around them. So a CEO in the last 6 months has found themselves dipping into survival mode leadership, which means that they're playing out a more I-centric leadership style. So it'll be maybe more reactive, it'll be maybe more to do with them and their concerns. They might have suddenly become less collaborative, they might have become more directive. And that then filters down into the organisation. So as we all know, the cultural custodian is at the top, it's the CEO and the board, and then that culture filters down. When you've got people who are going down the change curve into their own survival mode leadership style, and then you've got that tone happening at the top as well, you might have found over the last 6 months that there's been some fairly chaotic and knee-jerk decision making going on. So what we now need to do, if you're coming out into exploration mode, is we need to reassure people and calm that nervous system down through listening and through communication to help people come out of survival mode that will be affecting their day-to-day decisions, regardless of what role they're in. So you'll see people accounts payable to health and safety to the IT department making decisions on a day-to-day basis that aren't necessarily the way that they would normally do things. We've got to get comfortable making decisions based on the reality of now. And like I said previously, that requires a higher level of communication and collaboration. It doesn't mean more meetings. Now, I've had a number of clients say to me, oh my God, I've got Zoom meetings coming up my ears and everyone wants to collaborate over Zoom. That isn't necessarily the way forward. It can mean a simple text or a simple email or a quick phone call. We seem to have lost the ability to just pick up the phone and just make a quick phone call. So what I've said to a lot of my clients is, have you got time in your diary for an hour a day where you're just responding to voicemails, or where if someone's dropped you a text message, you're just picking up the phone and having a 2-minute conversation and they're saying no? And that's really important that we create that space, because decisions can be made much faster when we've got that space to just pick up the phone and have a 2-minute conversation, rather than relying on a chain of emails or relying on the next Zoom appointment that you've got with someone. So we need to get more comfortable making decisions in a more agile, quick way based on reality of now, assuming that we're going to keep updating each other and we're going to keep moving through the decision-making process together. It takes a huge amount of emotional intelligence to stay grounded in this reality, because your brain is naturally going to want to go to the future. It's going to naturally want to anchor on some kind of certain outcome, and there are no certain outcomes. The irony of what we've experienced over the last 6 months is there was never any certain outcomes anyway, but we had the data and we had the evidence around us to suggest that the world was predictable and that the world was a lot more secure than it is occurring to us today. We are now finding that people are seeking something to anchor in, and Glin's gonna pick this up about what you anchor to and how you anchor to something when you've got all of this uncertainty around you. But flexing your emotional intelligence, working on grounding yourself in the reality, bringing yourself back to what's actually happened today, and not allowing your thoughts to try and project too much into the future, or even focus overly on the past, is really, really important at this moment in time. So, hello?
A question has come through that is directly related to that, so I thought I'd drop it in now. So one question has come in, how do you balance that this is the right decision based on the information today, but it actually might change? So the U-turns coming in with the government continually make, doing, which is undermining all decisions. How do we balance that?
Really good question, and the answer for me is it's about being really transparent. And there are so many leaders who feel so uncomfortable saying, do you know what, this might change, because historically we're used to being the ones that have all the answers, and there's a need for leaders to become comfortable not knowing and become comfortable with uncertainty, but become comfortable saying, actually, we don't have all the answers, and this is the best decision that we can make today given the current circumstances, and please trust us. This is why it goes back to the emotional intelligence side of it, because it's to do with trust, it's to do with your values, it's to do with what you're saying and how you're saying it, and your behaviour, which is to have people reassured that they can trust you to then make the next best decision and the next best decision based on the changing environment. So previously, we would rely on board reports, we'd rely on KPIs, we would rely on data, we would rely on the tangible. People are now having to rely on the intangible leadership style. They're having to rely on, okay, that person, I can trust that person. I know I can trust that person because when they've said this message, and this message, it's aligned with what I'm hearing everywhere else. When the way they're behaving is in alignment with the values of the organisation. What I'm seeing from this person as a leader, from an EQ perspective, is what I'm going to anchor onto and trust, because previously I was trusting the data and the numbers and the certainty of a framework such as government policy or whatever it might be. None of that is now stable. So people are going to be anchoring onto people, the human side of it. Are you a person I can trust and believe? And should I follow you?
Right.
So leading through, so how to lead through this uncertainty. So the first point on this slide is the acknowledgement piece. So the acknowledgement piece is about the communication style, and it's about that listening filter. Really get under the skin of how people are listening to you, how they're listening to the business, how they're listening to each other, and where are they on that curve, and what's got them there. So you'll have some people who might say that they're almost up at acceptance. I saw a couple of acceptances coming through, but if you've got some people in your team who are saying, oh, I'm still in anger, and you've got other people who are on acceptance, find out how the people who are acceptance got there and have them support the people who are still in anger. As leaders, we often think that it's our responsibility to fix people's emotional, fix this for people or find the solutions for people. But the great thing that I learned when I retrained to be a coach is we don't have the answers. The answers are in them. They know how they need to get themselves out of this change curve dip. They know what they need. It's just a case of creating that space and asking the right questions for them to tell you what they need. So as a leader, I'd urge you to recognize that you are responsible for the emotional well-being of your teams and for helping them through this change curve. But you're only responsible for giving them the space and the time and the support to surface what they need so that they feel safe to say what they need. And then once they've said what they need, it's within their gift to then figure it out, if that makes sense, which actually should hopefully be a relief to you all, to know that, you're not responsible for having people actually move from anger into exploring. They are. It's just that you need to enable them and have them support each other. Align your communication and decision making accordingly. So you're going to have different individuals on different points on the curve. You're going to have different teams on different points, different departments. If you're a global organization, you're going to have different divisions and regions. And then we've got different companies. So your suppliers might be on a different part of the change curve to your customers. And then we've got different countries and continents. So if you extrapolate this change, because this is a completely unprecedented event where we've got this global event where everybody and everyone and everything is on this change curve at some point in time. And so it's really important that you understand it so you can align your communication with your stakeholders internally appropriately, align your communication with your stakeholders externally appropriately, so that you're getting the most out of those interactions, because their listening is going to be filtered by where they are on this curve and the decision making. Trust your teams to do the right thing. Now, this is the time to really assume that your teams are more capable than you've ever assumed before. We always, as leaders, underestimate the capabilities in our teams, and we're always pleasantly surprised when we open that hatch door and give them more responsibility and give them more accountability. This is really now the time to trust that your teams know how to do the right thing and be more accepting of failures. Again, of course, in line with that risk appetite, risk tolerance framework. And empower your people. Like, there's this lovely story, Kevin Johnson at Starbucks. He's obviously got thousands and thousands of outlets all over the world. And in I think it was April, May time, he didn't know how centrally to control reopening stores or keeping them closed. He said, you know what, store managers, branch managers, every single one of you is now empowered, and you can autonomously decide locally how to respond to this based on the communities that you're serving and based on what's happening from a pandemic perspective locally. So he just fully empowered them, and he decentralized the whole management of the COVID response. So that's a really important case study for you to consider when you're looking at how your teams are being utilized and empowered.
Questions coming through.
Oh, there's questions coming through.
Yeah, so how do we practically obtain feedback from our teams re change curve when we manage large teams?
So Survey Monkeys, online surveys, things like this. I mean, if I was a leader, you're all going to get the recording of this afterwards, and you'll get the slides as well. I would, as a head of audit, I would run one of these webinars myself internally. You don't have to be an expert in this. You are an expert in this because you're a human being. That's the great thing about emotional intelligence. We all know what it is and we all experience it. And it's, once you understand the key concepts around what's going on, it's quite easy for you to then provide that space for people to share and open up into. What indicators should you look for when judging where someone else is on the curve? I would probably advise against trying to judge where someone else is on the curve, and I'd use the inquiry and the questioning. So because at the moment judging and our perception and our judgment is probably potentially not correct, and it would be emotionally unhelpful for that individual if we were to judge it incorrectly. So I'd definitely go direct to asking and getting people to respond. It was amazing to see all your responses when I asked for you to say where you were on the curve. If you could get your organisation to just do that and just say this is where we're at, and then have a kind of a change curve map, emotional map of where everybody's at, and then accordingly respond that way, that would be perfect. How do you manage the team's expectations when it comes to moving along the change curve? What if you know they're expecting you to fix how they feel somehow? Really great question, Tessa. And teams probably are expecting a higher degree of fixing from leadership. And it's about having them understand that as an emotional being, you're not psychic. You're not someone that is following them around every day in their pocket, and you're not the only person that's with them all the time that really understands them and knows what's going on for them is them. So while you can provide that space for them to share with you what's going on, it's their responsibility to notice it. And Glin's going to come on to this around self-awareness and how people need to become more self-aware about what's going on for them so that they're being more powerful in their self-leadership. So you'll answer that one later on.
Absolutely.
Would you ask where people are on the curve, individual in a group? I would say whatever. I don't think it makes a difference. We've just asked 80 people on a webinar and pretty much got a response from everybody. Or you could ask someone individually and still get a response. I think really just be asking. Ask your friends, ask your family, ask your team, really start inquiring, because you're going to start getting a feel for what's going on around you, and that's going to inform you. This is the new data that we now need to start receiving. It's not in a spreadsheet, it's not in an enterprise data warehouse, it's around us in the way people are feeling. That's what's really valuable now for you from an insights perspective. I have talked enough, and I am going to introduce my wonderful colleague, Glin Bayley, who's now going to finish off what I've just started. Glin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just come on to the next bit. We'll come back to any questions that we haven't answered in the first piece at the end as well. So if they've been missed, we'll definitely come back. My experience has also been in finance. So I'm a SEMA management accountant by background. I've spent the majority of my career in the UK up until 5 years ago when I moved to Australia. 10 and a half of the last years of my career were with Associated British Foods, and prior to that General Electric and Coca-Cola. So predominantly FMCG background and commercial, head of commercial finance, head of finance, so a number of different roles. So I've had the finance acumen for 17 years of my career, and 2.5 years ago left to essentially go into consulting. Again, similar space to Zoe around coaching, leadership, but specifically in the space of self-leadership. So if I kick on into my part of the presentation here, my belief here is, I'm just going to move the chat box just a little bit out the way. There we go. Great. So my focus really is very much around, change leadership begins with self-leadership. So it's the sense that ultimately, if we're trying to lead others without having self-awareness of how to lead ourselves, we're going to fall short. Not only is that going to be not a possible ability to be able to lead others where you haven't gone yourself, but also the inconsistencies that show up in your leadership will show through if you're not aligning the way you show up to others and the way you occur to others in the way that you want them to be. So what I wanted to share with this framework is this is a core framework that I use with leaders on helping them get clear on their self-leadership. It will also talk a little bit to what Zoe's connected to in terms of the change curve. So in this framework, and I call it the HEART methodology, it's all about understanding what's actually going on in the individual's hearts of the teams that you're looking after, but also yourself. So the recognition here is to say, okay, where is my heart, and what do I actually mean by that? And in this instance, it's being clear on where you want to go. So in this environment now, we've seen a significant amount of change. There is uncertainty. We've gone through the dip. Many people are in the exploring phase, but what they need to be anchoring into is a vision of the future to where they want to be moving. So whilst the current landscape is changing significantly, what they're anchoring into is their hope. So an idea of, I've got an idea of where I want to be versus today, and I can see where I want to be headed. What we're also thinking about when it comes to self-leadership is our fuel. So do we have the energy to go after that destination? So things are moving, depending on where people are on the change curve, will determine what level of fuel they've got internally and for the organisation to be able to show up and deliver performance at a level that is required to meet that goal and that objective. In this environment also, when we're looking at action, it's that recognition that information is going to be different. Just to what Zoe talked about, is the data points that people have used up until now have been in systems and in processes, but what we're now having to do is read the room. We're having to read ourselves, we're having to read emotions, we're having to read different people's behaviours, and that's going to determine what do we do differently when it comes to taking action. So knowledge is only going to be really powerful if it's applied, and that requires us to do something with that. Resilience, and I think a few people had mentioned this in the comments as we were starting, resilience is going to be key because the landscape is consistently changing. What we have to ask ourselves is, what is our bounce back rate? So it's not necessarily saying that we're not resilient because we're human and we're all alive. We're on this webinar, so it suggests we're resilient in some capacity. But what we're trying to understand about ourselves is, what is my capacity to recover quickly from any setback? So if a decision doesn't result in a favourable outcome, am I taking that on myself and going deeper into that sense of, oh, I've got something wrong, or actually have I got an opportunity to reframe that in a way that powerfully moves me forward and bounces me back in a way that's more confident, especially from a self perspective, but also from a team perspective. How do people feel right now with all of this ambiguity and uncertainty about making decisions in a time where actually the answer may not be as clearly cut and the outcome may not be guaranteed with the level of certainty that perhaps they might once have perceived? And as Zoe mentioned earlier as well, trust. Trust becomes critical from a self perspective, because if you don't trust yourself in your leadership at this time, your ability to enroll others towards the vision that you want to take them to becomes compromised as well. So you have to be able to trust yourself, but enroll others in trusting you. And to Zoe's point earlier about empowering your team and showing trust in them in order to cultivate the courage that's needed to be able to deliver in this environment. And as I like that favourite quote, knowing yourself is the beginning of all wisdom. So if we could come on to the key sections here, what I want to talk to now is just how we lose ourselves in our stakeholders' needs. So if I think about hope, what I'm thinking about with hope in the context of the self-leadership framework is essentially the vision that we set for ourselves. If you consider it like a GPS map at the moment, we know where we're at today, and we have an idea of the destination and the vision that we want to create in the future. When it comes to self-leadership and also emotional intelligence, that has to start first and foremost with, what is the vision that I have for myself and my career and my leadership right now? Where am I currently in the context of where I want to be? And what's the gap that I can see in myself in terms of how I'm showing up, how I'm leading, what do I feel comfortable in, what do I not feel comfortable in? Then it's about really understanding where our stakeholders are on that journey. And as Zoe talked to, people are, that stakeholders could be your team, it could be your customers, your clients, other business partners. It's understanding where they are at on the change curve, but understanding where they're at in their journey towards where they would like to be and where they're at the moment. And when we're looking at that, what we're saying is, okay, if I know where I am at, know where my stakeholders are, then collectively we can align on what gaps need to be closed so that we can move forward together and stay on track with the performance. That really is the real nut of value creation, because we can sit in our own function, we can sit in our own reality of what does my particular area of the business need to be doing and how are my people performing. But if we don't understand where the wider network and the stakeholder base is, actually the true value that's created within your functions is somewhat lost, because you're looking too inward than you are looking outward to support them. As we mentioned earlier, is when we allow ourselves to recognize that the path that we might have once had to the destination and our goals that we're trying to achieve may change, we allow ourselves to be open to a different route to getting there. So to the point earlier, it's linking back to the questioning to say, actually, I don't have to have the certainty of exactly which route I'm going to take. But if I've got alignment on where we're trying to go as an organisation and as a team, what we allow people to do by asking questions is to identify the different paths to get there. And then the final point on this is just very much about framing appropriately. We mentioned earlier around, people might be in fear, the sense of psychological safety might be compromised. But if you're framing it such that saying, actually, right now we all might be feeling this level of uncertainty, we all might not know exactly how the outcome or the results might look. But if we understand and frame that it's okay if we get this wrong, what we're going to do is be very clearly articulating our assumptions. So if the data leads us to make a decision in one area, if that outcome isn't in line with that decision, what we can come back to is say, it's okay, it's another data point. It allows us to understand what shifted and what changed, and we make it safe for people to move forward in that. Moving on to the next part. One of the things in this environment is recognizing that when we've been thrown into chaos and we're essentially in that grief cycle around the change curve, we can often lose our sense of self, we can lose our anchor in how we're showing up, and we can be taken with essentially the tide as people are operating. And if your environment is in chaos, or if people are stressed, or if people are needing support and you're trying to be everything to everyone, we have to be mindful about our own energy as leaders. How are we showing up? Back to the energy point on the heart methodology is to say, do we have actually the fuel that's needed to get myself to where I want to go and to get my team where I want to go to? So first of all, it's about being authentic with who you are and you know yourself to be. In this environment, it's really easy to fall into the trap of being the chameleon to match your environment so that you can kind of be everything to everyone. But the real point here is to really anchor into your core values. When you understand your core values, not only are you clearer in making decisions because they're aligned to who you are, not only in work, but out of work too. But that consistency increases trust. And ultimately, when you're trusted and you're remaining true to who you are in terms of the values you operate and the values in alignment with your business, it will determine how you ultimately measure success as well. Also, standing for something. I think what's important in this when it comes to self-leadership is when we end up being chameleons, what we end up showing people is that we don't stand for something. And in a time like now, especially when there's so much chaos around, we have to stand for something. So if I look at the example of the political leaders that have led through the COVID crisis, Jacinda Ardern stands out as someone who's very much stood for the fact that she is open, responsive to going hard and making tough decisions, all with the end goal of having COVID eliminated out of New Zealand in a way that supports her country to get back on track sooner. Now, those decisions of going into lockdown for a lot longer and a lot harder earlier were unpopular, but she stood for something because she was clear about what she wanted. Now, I think with this, it's like, if I'm being everything to everyone, then I'm not standing for something, and people actually don't know what they can count on me for. And therefore, if people don't know what they can count on me for, it becomes really difficult to build trust and find your support network that are going to help you stay sane during this period of time. Around discovering who you truly care, what you truly care about, and helping others do the same. Our landscape between work and home life has become blurred more than ever. And I think the way we would have supported teams before would have been all about how do we get people together, how do we team build, how do we connect people to values that are all about the organisation. Now, when we've invited work essentially into our homes, what we have to do is really start to get to know who are our people. And how do we show them that actually supporting them and in a team environment is actually coming from a place of understanding what we care about, what they care about, and helping them find a way to live in alignment more with that, because we know actually the landscape has been blurred so heavily. And when we recognise that you're choosing to anchor in your values and you're making decisions in alignment with those, increasing the trust, what you actually then start communicating, not only just for yourself, but for your team, that the choices that we make are our responsibility. And you're way more effective as a leader as a result. And then finally, around boundaries, the best leaders that we have seen have boundaries. Now, this is a really hard time when, as I always talk to, people are on Zoom meetings. Most of the day, meetings end up getting blocked in, and you're then going, actually, I've spent all this time on meetings. I actually never get time to execute anything. Now, my guidance here is, whilst everyone is playing the short game, which is the immediate, let me just show I'm available, play the long game, because when it comes to energy and sustainability in terms of the performance game, we have to be able to set a clear direction for the teams. We have to be able to role model that leadership to say, actually, you know, what do I want to stand for, back to your personal brand, but what do I need in terms of the business performance, my own personal performance in terms of energy, and also my team's performance. So in order for me to be able to show others that we need to measure outcomes, not time spent at desk and in meetings, you know, moving away from presenteeism into a space of outcome focused leadership, what we actually ask is to people to say, right, let's take responsibility for my own boundaries, undertake a fuel audit. Now, most people here are in audit, so actually being able to take an energy audit for yourself. So how full, you know, we might not have a temperature or a fuel gauge like we would do with a car, but actually being able to do a measure of where is my fuel at the moment and where is my energy being wasted. So how much of my fuel to get us to the destination is actually being drained on things that actually don't support myself, my team, or my organization reach where it needs to go. Point 3, I love people pleasing actually pleases no one. No one likes a people pleaser, because to my earlier point, they don't stand for anything. They end up being what's merging with the environment around them, and it's not clear on what you can be counted for other than being yes. And in reality, nobody wants someone to say yes in a time of crisis when they need leadership, because you have to be willing to say no in order to drive for performance in a long-term sustainable way. Consistency, as we mentioned, is really important when it comes to trust, but it's also a measure of your integrity. So if you're setting boundaries around what's appropriate for work and home, and you're consistent with that, what people will do is follow your lead and say, okay, I understand that actually what my leader has got is a role model that says, I'm not going to burn myself out in the process of meeting this chaos, but I'm actually giving people, to Zoe's point earlier, ownership for their own choices, for their own leadership, and by role modeling the same. And back to the personal brand piece, burnout is actually visible to others as part of your corporate brand. And in the short term, it might look good to say, hey, I'm busy, I'm back to back in meetings all the time, and sorry, I've got no time to actually catch up or, you know, return a phone call or return a voice note because I'm super busy. But actually, it actually represents your corporate brand. It doesn't measure of someone that's got control. It doesn't give a level of certainty to someone if you're always busy and you don't have time to dedicate to understanding where potentially the snow might be melting at the edges of the organization. So you need to create space for yourself in order to really use the listening that Zoe talked to reach the edges of the organization, where those quieter voices, now that you can't see them in the office, may actually be potentially having their wheels fall off, and we're not actually aware that our team's wheels are falling off or our wheels are falling off because we haven't actually slowed down enough to create space to act for that listening. And then lastly, knowledge is really only valuable if it's applied. So we've spent best part of an hour, and I'm just going to wrap up so that we've got some time for questions. We've spent the best part of an hour now sharing knowledge and insight, but truthfully, it's going to be meaningless if it's not applied. So really having the time after this webinar to reflect, to listen back if you get the chance, but also think about what does this actually mean in terms of your emotional intelligence and how you're going to use it to be a more effective leader going forward, not only leadership at work, but leadership in life. So where are we going? I'm going to go back to the questions piece, because I think we can stop sharing and so see if we can see your beautiful faces now, and if there are questions, leave it open to the floor to ask and share.
Yeah, did we miss any, Jules?
Yeah.
Are there any that we didn't answer?
Just scoping through.
To drop it back in.
Yeah, I think we had a question a lot earlier on. I think it was in the decision-making section about that approach is not coming from their line manager, so it's difficult for them to be able to then pass that down. Have you got any advice around that? So actually almost going upwards as opposed to...
If I was coaching that individual, I would challenge the story around why that's difficult, because the difficulty is a perception. And yes, if there isn't alignment with yourself and your leadership, that can be perceived as difficult, but it can also be perceived as an opportunity. So I had that when I was at Howdens. I was leading my team in a very different way. I was asking them to audit the intangible. I was asking them to audit culture. I was asking them to audit behaviour, which was something that was new and different. And therefore I was actively out of alignment with some of the leadership team that I was auditing. But actually it was an opportunity for education. It was an opportunity for a conversation. It was opportunity for me to learn as well. So I didn't say, this is how I'm going to do it and this is why we're doing it. I said to them, actually, if I was to do this, because it's number one risk on our risk register, diminishing culture, if I was to audit that, what would be the best way of me going about it? It's about that inquiry. It's about actually opening up the dialogue and saying, do you know what? I've thought that maybe doing it this way is a good idea, but what do you think? What's your perspective? And have people be heard and have people be able to express why they think it's not a good way of doing things or why it's a good way of doing things. And just leave it at that, because actually people don't underestimate how much thinking goes on after a conversation. And I think we sometimes expect too much out of an exchange in a conversation. We expect the issue to be resolved in the conversation, but actually what happens is people go away, they think, they reflect, they'll have a conversation with other people, they'll sense check it with their peers or with someone at home. And all of that is, your conversation is a catalyst for change. And you may never see the link and you may never see the feedback even, but we just have to trust that by doing something different, trying something different and opening up a conversation around it, that in itself is a catalyst for change and it will have an impact.
And I just saw the question coming in, if I see my leader is burning out or struggling and they want to be more present for us, but the demands from higher up are pressing, I think it's the same answer that Zoe's just given, but just to frame that is to ask the questions about what they feel they're being perceived as. So for example, if you can see that they're burning out or struggling, and you're having a conversation to say, what is it, back to that, where are my stakeholders, whether it's upwards or downwards or sideways, where are they trying to get to? Understanding where they're trying to get to first, so really getting clear on what are you trying to achieve, where are we trying to go to? And back to that, okay, what is the most appropriate way for us to get there in a way that's sustainable for long-term success? And it's using coaching modality, and it's not typical for us, having been in a finance background where we are the experts and we're trained to be able to tell people the answers. But I think when it comes to leadership and emotional intelligence, asking the question around, okay, so if you're trying to get to here, and currently what I'm observing is you're working excessive hours, you look exhausted, how clear do you think your thinking is at the moment to support the long-term sustainable future of the team and the role? And getting them to realise that there's got to be a different way. And often I think we tell ourselves a narrative that we can't change things upwards, that it's more difficult, it's a direction from the top. But in this environment, we used to believe once upon a time that people couldn't deliver good work and work from home, right? COVID has now completely knocked that on its head, and businesses have survived with remote working because they've had to. So I would say challenge what we think our boundaries and our frames and the lens through which we're looking at the world is, because actually through every constraint, there's always an opportunity, but you have to look for the opportunity.
Beautiful. So what I'm going to suggest is, because we've only got 2 minutes, Jules, I'm just going to make a suggestion. If anybody has got a question that hasn't been answered, can you put it in the chat box? And what we'll do is we'll respond to you. We've got your email addresses. So with your permission, we'll respond to you and we'll reply to any question that you have that hasn't been answered by email. And you're also at the end of this going to get an opportunity to give us some feedback, and there'll be an opportunity to request some time with Glin and myself, which we're just offering No obligation, it's just a free opportunity for a conversation if you want us to help you try and design a way of getting the change curve temperature test on your organisation, or some more insight around resilience and what Glin's been talking about. We're on a mission to help people bring more emotional intelligence to the corporate world. Now is the time. From an audit and risk perspective, if you want some advice from me on how to have this discussion with the board and with the executive teams, because they want data still, you can bring data around emotional intelligence to the board. You can bring data around resilience. There is a way of doing that, and they will want to see evidence, and they'll want to be able to measure it and monitor it. I've got insights on that as well, as has Glin. So please let us know how we can help. We really hope that this has been a valuable session for you, and thank you for your time.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Julian.